Hello dear students, in this tutorial audio presentation I will discuss the broad questions. So the first one is that narrate the story of the play Mother's Day in about 100 words. The entire story you have to narrate in about 100 words. Very interesting one. So we know the play Mother's Day depicts the status of the woman in a family. What is the position of a woman or what is the status of a woman in a family is beautifully been portrayed in the play Mother's Day. She is treated as a domestic slave, taking orders from her husband as well as children. Now here also in this drama we found that Mrs. Annie Pearson, she was treated like a slave who takes orders from her husband as well as from her children. Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald are neighbors, and in terms of behavior and nature, they are totally opposite to one another, like North Pole, South Pole. They stand in sharp contrast to each other. I told you they are very different to each other in terms of personality. Mrs. Pearson is a submissive wife and mother. She is very submissive. Mrs. Pearson, she is very submissive. She is unhappy with the treatment she gets from her family. She is totally unhappy because she was never ever given any due recognition. She was never ever been given any due recognition, and one more important thing, apart from this, she worked really hard. But unfortunately it is all futile because her family members always used to take her for granted. So let me continue. She is unhappy with the treatment she gets from her family. She discusses her problem with her neighbor, and that is the next door neighbor, Mrs. Fitzgerald. The symbol of feminism, headstrong, short-tempered, and obviously a person who was an expert in terms of tarot card reading or black magic. She discusses her problem with her neighbor. Mrs. Fitzgerald is bold, liberated, and an aggressive woman. Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is bold, she is liberated, and obviously an aggressive woman. I also told you that she is the symbol of feminism also. We get to know about it. She knows the art of casting magic spells as well because she learnt about the magical spells in the East when her husband was posted back in the Middle East countries. She changes her personality with that of Mrs. Pearson. Now personalities change bodies. The high point of this drama, we know it by this time. So it was she who changed her personality with that of Mrs. Pearson. So I repeat this line. Please check it once again. She changes her personality with that of Mrs. Pearson. Then she stays on in Mrs. Pearson's house to deal with George. Then what she does? She stays in the house of Mrs. Pearson not only to deal with George but also to deal with her with Mrs. Pearson's two children. And what are their names? Doris and Cyril. Then she stays on in Mrs. Pearson's house to deal with George, Doris and Cyril. She sets them right and makes them see reason. Now it was her harsh counseling that rectifies the mentality of not only George Pearson but also Cyril and Doris. She cuts them to size. She gave a taste of their own bitter medicine. She cuts them to proper size. They agree to do as Mrs. Pearson desires. So they agree to do as Mrs. Pearson desires. The two women again become their old normal selves. The two women again, the magic that was been performed once before the arrival of the other three characters like George, Doris and Cyril. Now after that harsh treatment, on the request of Mrs. Annie Pearson, again Mrs. Fitzgerald performed the magic for the second time. And finally, we can say the play ends on a happy note. Now, I am moving on to question number 2. Question number 2 is also very important. Write a note on the theme of the play Mother's Day. What is the theme of the play Mother's Day? Do you approve of the method adopted by Mrs. Fitzgerald? That finally, do you approve the method that was adopted by Mrs. Fitzgerald? You have to elucidate. Elucidate means you have to elaborately explain it. The theme of Mother's Day is the low status of a woman in her family and how she deserves to be the boss of the house. But unfortunately, Mrs. Pearson was treated in such an inhuman manner that the question of her being the mistress or the boss of the house was totally unthinkable, or rather to say unimaginable. This issue is common in every country, particularly in our country it is very common. She is the weaker sex. She is neglected. Her services are neither acknowledged nor paid for. Now, neither her services were acknowledged, neither she was paid for her services. Mrs. Fitzgerald, the liberated and strong neighbor of Mrs. Pearson, shows the way. It was Mrs. Fitzgerald, the liberated, the symbol of feminism, and the strong neighbor of Mrs. Pearson. She showed her the way. Obviously, how? By the supernatural or magical intervention, or by performing the magic. And we know personalities change bodies. That is also one of the underlying theme of this play. And all these things are because of Mrs. Fitzgerald. So apart from her, magic is also one of the most important character, not a living one, but still it is a very important character in this play. So let me continue. She enters her spirit into Mrs. Pearson's body and spends a couple of hours in the neighbor's house. And within this couple of hours, she cut the family members into proper size. What I mean to say is that she gave a taste of their own bitter medicine. She gave them a taste of their own bitter medicine. She rectified them, and she deals very harshly with all the family members, George, Cyril and Doris. All of them are shocked, and not only they were shocked, they were equally surprised also at the changed behavior of Mrs. Pearson. They were shocked, they were surprised also at the changed behavior of Mrs. Pearson, because they haven't seen their mother to behave like this. Rather, George also haven't seen his wife to behave in this peculiar manner. They give it at last to her wishes. Mrs. Fitzgerald's method proves very successful in solving the problem. So ultimately we can say, or we can come to the conclusion that indeed Mrs. Fitzgerald's magical method, ultimately it proved to be highly successful. I am moving on to question number 3 now, dear students. Give your brief comments on the 5 main characters in the play Mother's Day. Very general question, generalized question, but very, very important question it is. Mother's Day is a humorous and satirical presentation. Actually, presentation, the other synonym is portrayal. Also, you can substitute that word in place of presentation, of a grim little family drama. Grim means something that is very tragic, that is very gloomy. It discusses the issue of the status of a mother, position of a mother, social identity of a mother. That is very important. Or social identity of the weaker sex, considering it from the broader perspective. And not only the status of a mother, but also the status of a wife in the family. The play has 5 important characters in all. Mrs. Fitzgerald is a very strong woman, aggressive and demanding. Her neighbor Mrs. Pearson is just her opposite, meek and mild, and very affectionate, loving, and a typical housewife. She is given to serving her husband and children. She is always at her toes, or in her toes rather, when it comes to serve her children and her husband. She is always at the beck and call. Now, she makes no demands. She does not dare to displease anybody, but she resents their behavior inwardly. Her husband George is pompous, selfish, and the center of jokes at the club. Now, the important thing is that her husband George is pompous, selfish, and most importantly, her husband George is at the center of jokes at the club. Her son Cyril is a young man and her daughter is Doris. Both are working in offices, but they do less work, they show off more. That is the main thing. They come home in the evening, demand tea and iron clothes so that they can go out again, because coming to home is just like entering a hotel. After few minutes or few hours of luxurious treatment, again they will venture out instead of spending time with their mother. This is very unfortunate. All the three are self-centered. George spending time at the parties, Doris and Cyril busy with their own life, and it seems that they are all self-centered. They never ever cared about Mrs. Pearson at all. They neglect Mrs. Pearson, who is all docile. I already told you, Mrs. Pearson submissive, docile, very meek and mild, motherly and submissive, exactly opposite to that of Mrs. Fitzgerald. Dear students, now I am moving on to question number 4. How does Mrs. Fitzgerald, passing for Mrs. Pearson, put Mr. George, Doris and Cyril in their places? Very important. How she actually controlled them, or how she actually taught them what is right and what is wrong. Mrs. Fitzgerald comes to the rescue of Mrs. Pearson, we know it, by performing that magic. She transfers her spirit into Mrs. Pearson's body and gets ready to show all the three members their right places. Her first target is Doris. She comes home, demands tea and orders the mother to iron her yellow silk, but she was being harshly treated by Mrs. Fitzgerald. But she is astonished when her mother goes on smoking and is planning to eat out at a restaurant, because she never ever seen her mother smoking and her mother stays at home only. So it is a big surprise for Doris. She gets a rough treatment that she is all in tears. The next target is obviously Cyril. He also finds his mother cold and defiant. Both suspect that she has hit her head against something, and they suspected that either she gone barmy or she had a concussion. Mother chides them. Chides means to scold, for whispering and laughing. George, as he enters the room, finds his wife smoking, drinking stout and playing cards. And this is the scene even George never expected in his life to see. He objects to all that, but is told curtly to shut up. He is told how the club members make fun of him behind his back. They call him Pompey Pearson. That was been told to him. Thus they all are made to realize how mean and selfish they are been towards Mrs. Pearson. So ultimately, Mrs. Fitzgerald made them realize how mean and selfish they were in actuality in their behavior towards Mrs. Pearson. Because neither George haven't expected that he will see his wife to smoke and drink and will behave in this harsh manner. So actually they are made to realize their position in the family, and it was been done by a magical thing, in a magical way, by Mrs. Fitzgerald. So dear students, I explained up to question number 4. In my next audio presentation, I will continue explaining question number 5, question number 6 and finally question number 7. So listen to it and clarify your doubts if any. Thank you students. Thank you all.